So it's finally time. After 6 months and 12 episodes, the 2H is going to finally go back in Dusty's chassis. So we got new engine mounts, we got new everything. We're going to slap this back in tonight and see if we can get it running. So the 2H has been sitting around for about 6 months now on its side, taking up space in the shed, and I've been waiting for it to get put back in the chassis. And tonight's finally the time. We're going to lift it up with the engine hoist, put new engine mounts on it and chuck it back in the chassis. So when I was taking it out, it took me about half an hour to get it set up right. Hopefully I'm a bit better at it this time and it goes a bit quicker. So before I go putting the engine in the chassis, I'm going to chuck some new engine mounts on. These are some nice new terrain tamer ones. And now for the transmission mount. So just going to give the mount a little bit of a clean up. So now a new one will just sit up there, put the new bolts in. So the 2H finally back where it's meant to be after 6 months. It's looking good in the new chassis. We'll just clean the engine up and it'll make it even nicer. So I couldn't help myself and I've rigged up a bit of a starting system. Now I've got to get the fuel going and I've got to get everything a little bit more sorted. But I've got the power, I've got ignition. So let's just see what we can do. So I've gone and bought myself a mechanical oil gauge just to see if we've actually got pressure or it's a faulty switch or something's going on. So I'm going to undo the switch there, plug the lines in, and then we'll give it a crank and see what happens. I'll just give it a turn over then to see if it'll work, and we've got a bit of oil coming up, and the gauge went to about 15 or so, so now we're going to give it a start and see if we can get some decent oil pressure. So before I run it any longer, I'm going to sort this cooling system out. So I've got the radiator upright, got the shroud, got the radiator. I'm going to give that a wash out with water. Then I'm going to fill the cooling system up with water, flush it out with some penrite, and then we can run it for longer after that. So I've just given the radiator a little bit of a rough paint job, just to make it look a little bit better. So the radiator's just sitting in there now. I've got to go bolt the fan shroud and all the radiator up. So she's all tightened down. I've just put a bit of paint over the bolts, make them look a bit nicer. Now it's time to put the hoses on. So this is what I've got set up. I've got the radiator on, all the pipes on, got some radiator flush here. I'm going to tip some of that in, take the thermostat out first, so that everything can just flow constantly, and plug the heater hoses up and we'll just let it run for 10 minutes. So I'll spend a good 10-15 minutes. Now I'm just going to let that flow out. So the next thing to do now after we've cleaned the cooling system is this is some oil system cleaner. It just finds it down and gets rid of all the gunk in the oil. So I'm going to tip this bottle in there, let it run for 10-20 minutes. Don't put it under any load while it's got this in it because it kind of really reduces the lubricity of the oil, and then we're going to replace it with some new stuff. So now I've drained the oil out of it, I'm going to have a look at this drain pan. Now it looks like it's been kind of butchered and everything from underneath here, so I'd like to pull it out and have a look what it's like from the inside, and probably clean some sludge out of the engine as well. So before I drop the pan bolts, I've got to undo this big bracket here, so that means I can get to the bolts behind there and then drop it out. So I've pulled the drain pan off, a little bit of oil left in it, having a look around, there's a few sparkles, but nothing too bad, no real dirt in it, it's not gummed up, which I'm pretty impressed about. So you can see where they've welded the bottom of the pan on, it doesn't look too bad, the welds come all the way through. The repairs in the bottom, they're not too bad either, so I don't imagine it's going to leak. So I'm just going to slap it back on, I've wiped it out, I'm going to put a little bit of seal around the outside and put it back on. And just like that, the oil pan's back in. Now I've got to get to this side of the engine and strip it all down to take the intake manifold off and paint everything. So now I've got the intake off, I can get to everything and I can replace the gaskets and clean everything up. So now there's a few 10mm bolts holding the EDIC motor on. So I've cleaned up the intake, I cleaned the inside up, gave it a bit of a polish. I just need some new intake manifold gaskets and it should be all good. So before I put the intake back on, I'm going to take this whole oil cooler housing off. Now I've got the gasket for it. If it starts to leak while it's in the car, it's a right pain of a job. So I'm going to do it now while everything's open. So I've got the rest of the bolts out. Now there's just this one top one that's holding it all in. So I've given the oil cooler a bit of a clean up, got rid of most of the oxidisation. There's a little bit left in there, but once it gets a bit of grease on it while it's in the engine you won't notice. Got all the injector lines drying, but now we have to work on the engine side of things and clean all the gasket material off and clean a bit of the rust out of it. So I'm just going to scrape some of the gasket material off. It's all stuck onto the block. So that took over an hour to get just the gasket material off. It was a right pain getting it down from the back of the injection pump, trying to get down there. But now I've just got to scrape all the rust out and clean the block up a bit. So now the housing in the block is all cleaned up. I'm going to put some gasket maker on everything, just so it really doesn't leak. And now with gasket maker on both sides, I can put the housing back in. So now that I've got all the oil filter housing and cooler on, I can put the intake manifold on now with some new gaskets. So I've got the new gaskets, I'm just going to slip them on. Now I can put the manifold on. Sit that there. So I've got all the fuel and injector lines here, and I'm just going to give them a bit of a sand, clean them up a bit, and then give them a spray with black paint. So I'm going to paint them all now. Just got a bit of rust guard. Put that in there. So now that I've got all the injector lines and the heater pipe painted, I can put it back on the 40 and see how it looks black. So I've got all the lines just sitting there. I just got to tighten them all down and put all the little brackets on. So now I just give all the lines a tighten down. So now that all the new painted lines are on, it's looking better than it did before. Cleaned up some of the rust. But now all I've got to do is put some new filters on. Now I've got a new oil filter and I've got a new fuel filter to put on. So I've loosened up the fuel filter and that just unscrews from under there. Just hand tight, doesn't need to be too tight. So now I've loosened the oil filter and that just unscrews off. So now before I put the new oil filter on, I'm going to fill it up with a bit of oil. Because it's such a big oil filter, it takes quite a while to fill. So if you do it before the engine starts, it saves having to pump it through and run the engine dry. So now that the filter's filled up, I can just screw it back on. And it's good because it sits upright. You don't have to tip any of the oil out. That means you can fill the filter right to the top with oil. So now all I've got to do is fill the engine up with oil. I'll take the cap off that. So now the final thing I have to do is bleed the fuel system. Use the pump and get some fuel going through it all. I've cracked the bleeder up here with a little hose running back down into the bottle. So now that it's coming out nice with no bubbles, I'm just going to crack it off while I'm still pumping a little bit. So that's the end of the episode. I've got the 2H back in, I've got everything running, I've got new oil in it. So the next few episodes, I'm probably going to be putting new gaskets and seals through the transfer case and gearbox.